The Game Boy is one of the most iconic and one of the most important game systems in history. I'd even go so far to say, it's one of the most important devices ever made because it brought portable gaming into the mainstream, which later turned into the idea of portable computers, which are essentially smartphones we use in our day-to-day lives. Needless to say, it was a massive success with the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color selling close to 120 million units, and the Game Boy Advance selling over 80 million. Although the Game Boy line eventually evolved into the DS line, which then evolved into the Switch, I still go back to my Game Boy frequently because of how many great games it has. There's many Game Boy models out there to choose from, and I have every one except for the Pocket for some odd reason considering how common they are, and the Game Boy Light, which I'm not surprised about because they were only released in Japan. But there's a Game Boy out there that's often overlooked that I consider to be one of Nintendo's greatest systems. This is the Game Boy Micro. Released in 2005, the Game Boy Micro was released almost a year after the DS launch, which might seem odd, but it's not something that's unusual for Nintendo after releasing a new kind of platform, and it's something we've seen as recent as 2017 with the release of the new 2DS XL a few months after the Switch launched. But there's something that sets past revisions on the Game Boy Micro apart, and that's the fact that most of Nintendo's revisions releasing after a new console were designed in a way to cut costs. The NES Top Loader, SNES Junior, new 2DS XL, and especially the Wii Mini, were designed in a way to lower production costs to cater to a market that didn't want to spend the money for the latest hardware, but still wanted to play Nintendo games. But in this regard, the Game Boy Micro is unlike any other Nintendo console. It wasn't designed in a way to cut costs considering it was $20 more than the Game Boy Advance SP at the time, which was around $79, while the Micro retailed for $99. But it's pretty clear they were catering to a completely different market. Looking at the Game Boy Micro, not only is it much smaller and sleeker than any other Nintendo console, it's also the only one that looks and feels premium. While the Game Boy Advance SP, DS Lite, and standard new 3DS are some of the sleekest and best designed systems out there, they look and feel like game systems, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the Game Boy Micro feels like a premium piece of hardware more than a game console, mainly because of the metal housing used, and just how sleek it is. This is the only Nintendo console to have metal housing, and it looks and feels excellent. Nothing quite like waking up to cold metal when you're gonna play some Game Boy games. It doesn't feel like a toy, and it kinda feels like a Game Boy Advance Apple or Samsung would make. The shoulder buttons are chrome, and so are the select and start buttons, but those are also illuminated when you start up the system. It's not necessary, but cool! And that's a theme you'll be noticing throughout the Game Boy Micro. Not necessary, but cool. There were a lot of things that weren't needed, but make the console so much cooler. The trademark feature of the Game Boy Micro, besides its small size, are the interchangeable faceplates. The Game Boy Micro usually came with a few different faceplates you could swap out, but if you have the Famicom version like I do, I don't think you'd ever want to do that just because of how gorgeous it looks already. But I do have a standard red faceplate that matches the console, and it looks radical. As with most things, you can't judge things solely based on appearance. And while the Game Boy Micro is easily the sleekest and dare I say, sexiest console ever made, how is playing games on it? The Game Boy Micro has a 2-inch screen and a backlight. Because of the smaller size of the screen, the games look sharper and cleaner than ever, all while having a nice backlit screen to play on. I might even go so far to say, its screen is nicer than the Game Boy Advance SP AGS 101. You initially might think the screen is too small. It really just depends on the person, but I never had an issue with the size of the screen. Unless you're playing a text-heavy game, I doubt it would ever be a problem. But how do the games play? Games on the Micro play great. The buttons in the D-pad are very nice, and since this is essentially like an NES controller but rounded with a screen, it's very comfortable to use. I always preferred playing games on the wider models of the Game Boy Advance compared to the SP, because I feel like my hands have more space and don't feel as cramped. The L and R buttons do feel a little bit cramped, but because of how small and sleek the system is, it doesn't bother me too much. And unlike the SP, there's a headphone jack, which is great. Guess Apple or Samsung could never make a system like this in this day and age. So far things seem too good to be true, right? A compact form, premium design and feel, an excellent screen, and great controls? Well, the Game Boy Micro does have some flaws. The biggest flaw with the Game Boy Micro is a lack of backwards compatibility with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. The system does have the capability of backwards compatibility, but for some reason, Nintendo decided to ditch it altogether for the Micro. But my reason to guess why it's lacking is just because how small the system is. Another issue that the Game Boy Micro has is it does not have a slot for accessories. That means no link cable, no hooking it up to a GameCube, and even sadder, no printer. A converter cable does exist, but it's hard to come by. And this leads me to the final issue. The main issue the Micro has is honestly more subjective to the user, but it's really important to point out. If you have any other Game Boy besides the light that needs to be repaired or modded, it's super easy to get replacement shells and parts, and they're relatively inexpensive. The Game Boy Micro is hit or miss. Replacement housing is available, but the quality is mixed to say the least. The problem you'll probably have the most is with the faceplates. Replacement faceplates do exist, and while the standard colors like the red one I have look great, let's say you want to replace a Famicom faceplate. I got my Micro when I was 14, so it did face some heavy use. I have yet to find a quality replacement, and the one I got was just awful quality. The latches that hold the faceplate in sometimes wear out over time, and a replacement part has yet to be created. Oftentimes, you'll have to get another Micro for replacement parts, and that's what I had to do when replacing my Famicom faceplate. Had to order one on eBay with the faceplate in better condition. Turns out that one didn't really work because the latches were broken, so I ended up returning it, made a deal with the seller, gave him a new silver faceplate that fit the system, and we're good to go. This is something important to bring up when looking into the Micro, and I feel it isn't brought up enough. If you ever plan to get a Game Boy Micro, make sure the latches are intact and make sure the faceplate is in good condition, because if not, finding replacement parts is very difficult as of now, but because the Game Boy Micro has somewhat of a cult following now, the future is looking bright. We did get replacement housing, so it wouldn't surprise me in the near future if we ended up getting more replacement parts. So all in all, what I think of the Game Boy Micro. The Game Boy Micro is one of my favorite consoles out there, but it's mainly because of personal reasons why I love it. The backlight and sleek form factor certainly are beneficial, but the metal housing, design, and faceplates are really all subjective. But what about looking at it practically? If you want a system to play Game Boy games on, you'll have to consider certain factors. Are you okay just being limited to Game Boy Advance games unless you get an Easy Flash or similar flash cart? Do you think it would be too small to play comfortably? And are you okay with the lack of replacement parts? Let's compare the Game Boy Micro to cars. The Game Boy Advance SP is a Honda Pilot, and the Game Boy Micro is a Rolls-Royce. Both serve the same purpose, but the Honda Pilot is much more practical, easy to repair, and is often less expensive. The Rolls-Royce is by far way cooler, has the wow factor, and a really cool design, but if something goes wrong with it, good luck being able to fix it affordably. If you want to play every Game Boy game on a backlit screen, the Game Boy Advance SP, preferably the AGS 101, is the most ideal option. Actually, with a little bit of modding skills, the original Game Boy Advance with an IPS screen is my favorite way to play. But if you really want something cool, super sleek, and a console unlike any other, the Game Boy Micro is easily for you. While it might not be practical, the Game Boy Micro is a Game Boy I find myself going back to the most, and in a lot of ways, it's one of the greatest and by far the coolest console Nintendo has ever made. I know it's a bit unlikely, but I would love to see a Nintendo Switch Micro in the future. We've come a long way since 2005, and if Nintendo were to make a Switch the size of a smartphone with metal housing and maybe interchangeable faceplates, I'd be all over that. Now if you want to get a Game Boy Micro for yourself, there are a few ways you can. They aren't rare by any means, but a bit uncommon, and range from around $75 to $120 on eBay, depending on condition and what variant you're getting. But what I'd suggest doing is going on sites like Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist and checking there every now and then, because you can get lucky and get a killer deal. I got mine at an estate sale via Craigslist for the low price of $0, and it's clear they didn't know what they had, or they just wanted a kid like me to have it instead of having it go to someone like Al from Toy Story. But either way, I thank those two every day, because the Game Boy Micro is truly unlike any other system, and by far the coolest system Nintendo has ever made. But what do you guys think? Anyways, thanks for watching, and keep calm and da-da on.